We're going to talk about dental pulp in Chapter 9. Basically, dental pulp is a soft connective tissue located inside of the tooth. It is a specialized connective tissue that contains thin-walled blood vessels, nerves, and nerve endings. So remember, there is blood supply and nerve supply to the pulp of the tooth. We don't see that in dentin or cementum or enamel. So that is something that is special to the pulp. Each pulp will open into the tissue that surrounds the tooth through that apical canal at the apex of the root. There is coronal pulp as well as radicular pulp. Coronal pulp is exactly what it states. It is the pulp located in the crown of the tooth. Radicular pulp is that pulp that fills the chambers that run through the root of the tooth. Each root has an apical foramina or opening where that can communicate with the periodontium that supports the tooth, and many teeth will also develop accessory canals in the root of the tooth as well. Humans have the potential to have 52 pulps, providing they have 20 primary teeth and 32 permanent. All of the pulps have that same gelatinous consistency, and the pulps of molar teeth are approximately 4 times larger than the pulp of an incisor. This picture kind of shows what can happen as we age. As we know, dentin continues to be laid down throughout our life. So when we're younger, the pulp chambers are much larger. And over time, due to age and trauma, that dentin has continued to lay down, which can cause those pulp chambers to become smaller. As you look from A through D of these images, you can see how that is happening. You can also notice the wear on the occlusal surfaces. The coronal pulp occupies the crown of the tooth, and it will follow the contour of the tooth. So if you have an incisor, it's going to follow that incisor. If you've got a molar, it's going to have pulp horns in all the locations of the different cusps of the tooth. It will join root pulp at that cervical region, and again will decrease with age. Radicular pulp extends from that cervical region where the coronal pulp stops, and it will continue on down through the root, whether that be a single rooted tooth like an incisor or a multiple rooted tooth like a posterior tooth. It can be tapered or conical, and again, it also becomes smaller as we age. The apical foramina and accessory canals are openings of that pulp to the periodontium. It's typically a small opening at the end of the root tip, and this allows contact of the pulp with periapical tissues. This is where, if there is infection in the tooth, it will drain out, and that's why we see those abscess or radiolucencies on our x-rays in those areas. So the histology of pulp, it is composed, like I said, of arteries, veins, and nerve trunks. So we have a blood supply there. It's surrounded by fibroblasts and collagen fibers that are embedded into that intracellular matrix. It is peripherally, odontoblasts are located against the wall of that predentin. And the odontogenic zone includes these odontoblasts as well as a cell-free zone, which is known as the zone of Veal, and the cell-rich zone, which contains all of those mini fibroblasts. And then, of course, there's the parietal layer of nerves. In your book, there's a nice image of those different zones and layers of the tooth, and that is located on page 113 if you'd like to get a closer look at that. The shape of the odontoblasts depend upon their location in the pulp. Obviously, they would be larger in coronal pulp than they would in the radicular pulp. They appear columnar in pulp horns and more cuboidal in radicular pulp. They appear more flat in the apical region. Fibroblasts are the most numerous cell in the pulp. The one thing about fibroblasts that sets them aside from some of the other cells is that they not only make connective tissue, but they also break it down. So they are in charge of producing collagen fibers and the ground substance in pulp. With aging, there's less activity of these fibroblasts, and they also have fewer organelles, which is pretty common with most cells. But the one thing to remember about fibroblasts is they not only build tissue, they also break it down. Some other pulpal cells that are discussed in the book are the Schwann cells, which I know you guys have discussed in anesthesia, and we touched on briefly. They form the myelin sheath around nerves. The endothelial cells line our capillaries, arteries, and veins. There's lymphocytes and blood vessel constituents as well. The fibers and ground substance, this is the collagen that exists in that extracellular matrix that surrounds the cells. I think of it as kind of like the jelly that holds it all together. There are two types found in our pulp. There's a type 1 collagen, which is probably produced by odontoblasts, and then the type 3, which is probably produced by those fibroblasts that we were talking about. And this type of collagen surrounds fibers and is also the ground substance of the pulp. As I stated, pulp is highly vascularized. The walls of the periodontal and pulpal vessels are very thin as they enter the pulp, and there is blood flow through the pulp, and it is rapid. The blood pressure in that pulp is extremely high. Myelinated and non-myelinated nerves enter the tooth through that apical canal, and they travel up into the coronal portion of the pulp. A mature pulp organ has a plexus or a group of nerves, and we can see this in the roof and lateral walls of that coronal pulp. These are observed less in the actual root portion of the pulp. This plexus of nerves is also called the plexus of Raschkow. Most pulp nerve endings are in that odontogenic region of the pulp horns. Some are in predentinal tubules, but usually still found in the pulp horn area, and they function in pain regulation. There are a couple different thoughts or theories on pain and the pulp-dentin complex. The direct innervation theory suggests that nerves extend into that DEJ, or the dental enamel junction, and studies have not shown nerves present at this junction, so that is unsure. The transduction theory is the theory that the odontoblast process is the neural receptor, and that it conducts pain to the nerve endings in that peripheral pulp. The hydrodynamic theory suggests that there's changes in fluid pressure within the odontoblast that stimulates the nerve. The nerve here in the pulp is a pain receptor, so any stimulus is transmitted as pain. Pain is the only sensation that we can actually sense in the tooth. In your book, again, there's some images that show you these different theories. And you will find that on page 124. It discusses the direct theory, where the dentin is directly innervated and where the odontoblasts act as receptors. And then the last one is the hydrodynamic theory, where fluid movement through the tubules is thought to stimulate the receptors in the pulp. Again, pain is the only perception that our teeth can send to the brain. The functions of the pulp. First of all, it gives the tooth vitality. But it's also important in initiating tooth formation. So this is the inductive function. It also forms dentin because of the odontoblast located there, so it is formative in nature as well. It is protective in that it responds to stimuli with the sensation of pain. It is nutritive because it carries oxygen and nutrition to the tooth, and it is also reparative due to the formation of reparative dentin. Some regressive changes that can happen over time with pulp. Exposure to stimuli from the environment can cause changes, such as trauma. This can cause a decrease in the size and can stimulate reparative dentin to fill in the area where dentin has been lost. As we age, the pulp chambers become smaller due to that constant replenishment of dentin. And also over time, cellular activity decreases as it does with all cells, so dentin is not immune to that, nor is pulp. Pulp stones are sometimes seen as well over time. They are just round or oval calcified masses. And on page 125 in your textbook, it shows the image that I have here in this slide. These are considered a pathologic condition and usually appear as a sprinkling of small or occasional large masses of mineral buildup or calcifications. A true pulp stone contains dentinal tubules. A false has no dentinal tubules, so they can be identified as either true or false. And they're also further classified as free, where they're free floating in that pulp. Or if they're attached, they would be attached to the dentin, or they can actually be embedded within that dentin. So those are the three different classifications. Here's another image that you'll find in your book again on page 125 that shows those different classifications of pulp stones. Diffuse calcifications can also occur. These are irregular calcified deposits that occur along the different collagen fiber bundles, or you might see them in the blood vessels in the pulp. They are more often in the root canal system than they are in the coronal pulp.